All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'll pray for us. Father, thank you for your word, for the beauty of your word, the power of your word, the meta-narrative elegance of your word. I pray that as we come to the Psalms today, that you instruct us as your people. We want to read the Bible well. We want to read it in a way that brings your promises to us. I pray that you would work in our lives as a means of grace today as we look at this text, and I pray you help us ask great questions, and in all of it, I pray that you draw us to the Lord Jesus, for it's in his name that we pray. Amen. So what day is it today? Is today a special day? What's the special day today? It's Halloween, right? Do you know where the term Halloween comes from? Do you know why we celebrate it by dressing up in costumes? Well, it's actually Reformation Day. So in October 1517, on this day, 502 years ago today, Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian monk at the time, nailed 95 debate points on the door in Wittenberg, Germany. And he nailed those points of debate written in Latin, not wanting to start a worldwide movement, but to simply say, here are 95 things that I think the Catholic Church has missed the boat on. And he was a Catholic at the time. He was not wanting to not be a Catholic, but he said, look, when people are selling pieces of paper called indulgences, where the Pope will sign it, and for a certain amount of money he'll forgive whatever sin that you want to commit. Luther said that's not right. That's not the Christianity presented in the Bible. And little did he know that within 2 weeks he would have started a movement. And if you go to a church today that's not a Catholic church or an Eastern Orthodox church, then your church actually celebrates part of its birthday to this day back in 1517, 502 years ago today. And when he posted those debate points on the door at Wittenberg, Germany, it was the eve of All Saints' Day, and people did very superstitious things to ward off evil spirits. So the eve of All Saints' Day was called Hallows Eve, and that's where we get the term Halloween from. And it's part of the reason that culturally we do the things we do, but it actually goes back to a very interesting religious time and an interesting religious debate. So, happy Halloween, happy Reformation Day, the eve of All Saints' Day. What we're going to look at today is a strategy for reading the book of Psalms. If you've ever come to the book of Psalms and you started reading it, you're immediately faced with a lot of questions. Who is speaking in the Psalms? Is this about David? Is it about Jesus? Is it somehow meant to be introspectively read, where the words are somehow my personal words as I read them? Who's speaking in the Psalm, and is there an organization to the book of Psalms? And so that's what we want to look at this morning. And so let's dive in, understanding the Psalter in its context. Have you ever read in your English Bible, have you ever seen a page like this where it says Book 1 of the Psalter or Book 2 of the Psalter? Have you ever noticed that when you're reading through? You can see it in this printed copy right here. Book 1, Psalms 1 to 47. Well, it turns out there are 5 books in the Psalms. The Psalms as a whole, many people call the Psalter. It's divided into 5 sections. It's clear that they're not being divided chronologically, because Psalm 90 is the oldest one, and it's called a prayer of Moses. What's interesting about books 1 and 2 of the Psalter, it ends, the final sentence in book 2 says, these are the prayers of David. The prayers of David are ended. And Psalm 72 is actually written by Solomon. So the text is saying, look, these are collected, they're prayers, they're the prayers of David. David prayed through these things. The oldest psalm is Psalm 137, which mentions the exile to Babylon. And so when you look at the whole span, it's written over a period of 5 centuries, and there are other 5s in the Bible. So Moses wrote 5 books as part of the Pentateuch. That's what Pentateuchos means, the 5 scrolls. There are, in a Hebrew Bible, if you open it up and look at it, there's actually a section called the 5 scrolls, the Hamesh Megilloth, which includes Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. The reason those are collected together as 5 is because each of those books were read on a particular feast day. So if you go to Israel today and you happen to be there about a month before Easter, you can go into a synagogue and they'll be celebrating what's called Purim, which Purim is the Jewish Halloween. So people will dress up as characters in the book of Esther. They'll come together and read through Esther, and whenever the name Haman is said, as they're reading the scroll aloud, everyone in the audience will hiss. And then anytime the word Mordecai, the name Mordecai is read, everyone will cheer. And so if you have a sentence that said Haman said to Mordecai, yay, such and such, they're reading through this scroll as part of the Feast of Purim. Purim is celebrates the day when Haman cast lots to destroy the Jews. And then 11 months later, in the midst of his plot, he was destroyed and his family. It's interesting to me that one of the Nazi war criminals, one of the 12 war criminals who were hung when he ascended the gallows, and they asked for any last words, and he said Purim Fest 1945, saying, "We tried to destroy the Jews and we have been destroyed." And so it's interesting, you have these 5 scrolls. It's really interesting to me that Song of Songs is read over Passover Sabbath. Passover Sabbath, as I understand it, is the Sabbath that follows Passover. During that celebration, Song of Songs is read. If you've ever read Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, you'll realize immediately that this is very steamy material, very sexual material, erotic material almost. And it's odd that the Jewish people would regularly read Song of Songs on Passover Sabbath. What's interesting to me as a Christian about that is Passover Sabbath was the day Jesus was laying in the grave. And so this idea of 2 people waiting to come together sexually to celebrate their marital love together is interesting, that Jews were in the habit of reading that book the same day Christ lay in the tomb. Ruth is read at Pentecost, which is the giving of the law. Lamentations is read on the 9th of Ab, which celebrates the destruction or laments the destruction of the temple in 586. Ecclesiastes is read during the Feast of Tabernacles, and Esther read during Purim. And so you might wonder, well, do the Psalms have something to do with that? Do they have something to do with the Pentateuch? Matthew, as well, in the New Testament, is divided into 5 sections. There, Jesus is being presented as the new Moses, the super Moses. So perhaps is the Psalter somehow related to all of that? When we look at the Psalter, this is what we see, that Psalm 1 that we're going to look at today is the preface to the Psalter. Psalm 1 and 2 are the only 2 psalms that don't have the ascription belonging to David. They form kind of a preface to the 5 books of the Psalter. Just in terms of observation, Book 5 of the Psalter has what's called the Psalms of Ascent. 15 psalms, short psalms, that apparently during Passover, the Jewish people read out loud as they climbed up the 15 steps to the temple. And as they came up each step, they would sing, or their representative would sing one of the Psalms of Ascent. What's very interesting to me as a believer is the realization that Jesus, as he hung on the cross, could hear the Psalms of Ascent being read out loud. And the Mishnah even tells that when the largest crowd was there on Passover in 3 different groups, that they recited the Psalms of Ascent, and the Mishnah even tells us where they ended when the third group sacrificed. And if we're reading this in terms of a biblical meta-narrative, Jesus, as the people were stepping closer and closer to God as he died on the cross, was hearing these psalms read out loud. The last 5 psalms, 46 through 150, all begin with the word hallelujah, and perhaps form kind of 5 appendices to either book 5 or to the book as a whole. When we just look at the book, there are repeated psalms. I don't know if you know this, if you've ever read through the psalms, but there are places where in the psalms you have exactly the same psalm. And so Psalm 14 is exactly the same psalm as Psalm 53, except one word has been changed. The word Yahweh has been changed to Elohim. Psalm 40, 13 through 17 is included in Psalm 70. Psalm 57, 7 and following is repeated in Psalm 108. And when you look at that, you realize that you have Psalm 14 and Psalm 53. They're exactly the same psalm, but they appear in 2 different books. And so some people wonder, are these 5 different hymn books that Israel used and perhaps rotated in their worship? Is there some kind of sequence involved here? What is going on? How should we read this? Well, if we take any instruction from the New Testament, this is how the New Testament would say, read the Psalter. And that is, the New Testament would apply Psalms to Jesus. So Psalm 110 from book 5 of the Psalter is the most quoted psalm in the New Testament. It may appear as many as 30 different times where they're quoting parts of this little 7-verse psalm. Jesus himself quotes Psalm 110 and asks the question, if Psalm 110 is about Solomon, which most people would read Psalm 110 as being about Solomon, Jesus said, how can David call Solomon his Lord? The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. And Jesus said, if that's about Solomon, how can David call his own son my Lord? And Jesus' point, it seems to me, seems to be that Psalm 110 isn't about Solomon, it's about someone else. And he invites us into the examination. Well, who is it about? When we come to book 1, as we saw last time, this is the psalm that Jesus quotes as he dies. And in 2 of the Gospels, it's the only thing that Jesus says from the cross. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. In Aramaic, oh my God, for what reason have you abandoned me? And of course, that's the first line in Psalm 22. And we saw how many parts of that psalm how many parts are applied to Jesus in the New Testament. Psalm 31 is applied to Jesus. That may be the psalm, into your hands I commend my spirit. Psalm 2 says, he said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Psalm 45 is a strange wedding between a king and a beautiful woman being told to abandon her family and to love the king. But then it starts calling that king God. And strange thing, I didn't really know you could call the king God, but in Hebrews 1, that passage said that's God the Father calling God the Son God in Psalm 45. And in Psalm 91, book 4, this is quoted by the devil, but it's assumed to be about Jesus because the devil says, look, Psalm 91 says, throw yourself off the temple and God won't let your foot be dashed against the stone. And so the odd thing there is that the devil is assuming that Psalm 91 is not about David, but rather that it's about Jesus. And when we just start going through and looking at all the different ones the New Testament applies to Jesus, either Jesus himself or someone else, you can see that it's many Psalms, and it's from every single book of the Psalter being applied to Jesus. Psalm 102:25 is really interesting to me because if you just read Psalm 102, you would say that's about God. But when you read the New Testament interpretation of Psalm 102, they're applying it to Jesus. And they apply a lot of things to Jesus. When we come to Psalm 16 is part of Peter's first sermon in Acts 2. And Peter makes the point. The Psalm 16 says, you will not abandon my soul to Hades. You will not let your Holy One see corruption. And Peter makes the point, David was dead and buried. So how can Psalm 16 be about David when the details of Psalm 16 don't agree with David's life? And so when we look at the Psalter and look at what the New Testament writers are doing, the New Testament writers appear to read the text Christocentrically. They seem to be interpreting vast parts of the text about Jesus. So when we come to Psalm 1 and see that it functions as a preface, we want to ask some questions about that, or make some observations. One observation is that Psalm 1 and 2 are together, and they function as an introduction to the whole Psalter. And you might say, well, why do you say that? Well, because Psalm 1:1 and Psalm 2:12 have what's called an inclusio. An inclusio is where you start and end with the same words. And whenever you do that in a literature text and a biblical text, whenever you have an inclusio, it's saying read all this together. And there's a feature that's almost impossible for us to see in English. But at the end of Psalm 2, part of that sentence is written in another language if you're reading through it. The text in our English translations will say, kiss the Son lest he be angry. The problem, and that's a perfect translation of 2:12, the problem is it's translating two different languages in the verse. Most of it's in Hebrew. The word the Son is in Aramaic. It would be exactly the same in English if I read that verse and said, kiss den Zoon, lest he be angry. And you would hear that and you may could recognize, okay, I know that's supposed to be the Son, but why in the world did he put it in German? That exact feature is happening in verse 12 of 2. You have a phrase that's written in Aramaic, kiss not the ben, which is the Hebrew word for son, but rather kiss the bar. Kiss the son, but the word son in Aramaic. And if the early text of the Bible was written in Paleo-Hebrew, the way, say, the Hezekiah's inscription was written in the 9th century or 8th century, then the text would actually be written in 2 different fonts, if you could imagine that. And so you start saying, well, what in the world does all that mean? Well, we're going to dive into it, but before we do, we want to look at Psalm 1 and 2 in the New Testament. So this is quotation from Psalm 2. Acts 4, this is Peter speaking, who through the mouth of our father David, your servant, said, by the Holy Spirit, quote, why do the Gentiles rage and the peoples plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christos, his anointed one. Peter is pointing out that in the Hebrew text of Psalm 2, if we read it out loud, it would say against the Lord and against his Messiah. Peter is not reading Psalm 2 about David. He's reading it about Jesus. Paul does the same thing in Acts 13. Paul says, this he has fulfilled to us their children by raising up Jesus, as it is written in the 2nd Psalm, you are my son, today I have begotten you. And then Hebrews 1:5 makes this point, for to which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? Or again, I will be a father and he will be a son to me. Hebrews 5:5, so also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So all these New Testament authors are coming to Psalm 2 and saying Psalm 2 is not about David. Psalm 2 is about Jesus. And same thing in the book of Revelation in chapter 2:26, to the one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. That's quoting Psalm 2. And as earthen pots are broken in pieces, even as I myself have received authority from my Father. So we've come to the Psalter, we've seen the 5 books, we've seen the divisions. Well, what does this psalm actually say? Well, this is what it says. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, or stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by the streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. The wicked are not so, but they are like the chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Now, when you just look at that psalm, it's divided into two sections, right? One's about the blessed man, one's about the wicked. Kind of an easy approach. And the normal way people would approach this psalm is to say, just be the blessed man. You don't want to be in the bad group, be in the good group. And so be the blessed man. Well, how do you be the blessed man? Well, don't walk with evil people. Don't stand with them. Don't sit. People often see a progression there, an association, an interaction, and then just a comfortable accommodation. The problem with taking that kind of existential approach where the blessed man is about me is that it really doesn't pay attention to the details of the text. Because what can be translated, blessed is the man who walks not, can equally valid be translated, blessed is the man who did not walk in the counsel of the wicked, who did not stand in the way of sinners or sit in the seat of mockers. His delight, his constant delight, his continual delight is on Yahweh's Torah. And on Yahweh's Torah, he meditates day and night. Now, I think I asked in the homework, if you had chance to look at that, to look at the beginning of Psalm 3. And if you look at the beginning of Psalm 3, the beginning of Psalm 3 says in the preface, this is the psalm David wrote when he fled from Absalom, his son. And if you read the scriptures, you say, when did David flee from Absalom, his son? Well, he fled from Absalom, his son, after David had slept with his neighbor's wife Bathsheba, and then murdered his faithful neighbor Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, because he wanted to cover up his hypocrisy. And the result was Absalom slept with David's concubines in broad open daylight, so the whole country could see, and the result was civil war, and David's daughter Tamar gets raped, Absalom gets killed, Amnon gets killed. It's a horrific story. Did David delight on the Torah of God day and night? Was he meditating on the law of God when he's spying this beautiful naked woman on the rooftop? Or was he meditating on something else? The blessed man is the man who did not walk, stand, or sit. The blessed man is the one who constantly meditated on Yahweh's Torah. And the result is he will be like the tree of life. Did you pick up that analogy when the tree planted by the streams of water? Exodus 47 seems to be picking that up. If you read all the way to the New Testament, Revelation 21 seems to be picking that up. The blessed man will be a tree of life, and he will bear fruit every single month. Did David do that? His leaf does not wither. This is an interesting phrase in the Hebrew text because it's related to the word Nabal. And do you remember this story? There's a man, his name is Nabal, and he's married to this beautiful woman, Abigail. Do you remember that story? And David, before he was king, sent a messenger to Nabal and said, "I've protected your sheep and your herds, and I've not taken anything from you. Will you give my men something to eat?" And Nabal says, "Well, who are you that I should help you at all?" And it's interesting in the Hebrew text, it's a little vulgar, but David says, "I'm going to kill everything that pisses against the wall." That's what it says in Hebrew. I think in our translations it maybe says something like urinates again. But David says, "I'm going to kill everybody. That guy insulted me, I'm going to kill everybody. I'm going to kill every male there." And he's on his way to kill the people. And Abigail realizes it, and she loads up all the food, and she takes it and gives it to David. And she says, "Look, my husband, his name's Nabal, and he's an idiot." And that's what Nabal means, a person who's a fool. It's interesting that this word wither is the word Nabal. In his leaf does not Nabal, does not become foolish. It's also interesting in Hebrew to me that the word dead body is, I think it's the word Nabalah or something like that, the foolish thing. When you look at a corpse, you call it the foolish thing. But the person who meditates on God's Torah, he's going to be a tree of life. He's never going to wither. He's never going to become foolish. He's never going to die. And whatever he does prospers. Can those statements be said of David? If you went to David's daughter Tamar and said, "Did whatever your dad do prosper?" would she say yes or no? She would say no. She says, she would say, "My dad's dabbling in pornography," or whatever you call what he did on the rooftop, led to adultery, and then that adultery led to hypocrisy, and then that hypocrisy led to murder, and then that murder, "Look, if Dad did it, why can't I do it too?" Tamar would say, no, this was a terrible thing. No, he isn't the blessed man of Psalm 1. And just to make the point that this, to be able to translate this "did not walk," notice that's how all the ancient translations translated. Happy is the man who did not walk. The Psalm Targum, happy is the man who has not walked. Douay-Rheims Apocrypha is the translation of the Latin Vulgate. Blessed is the man who hath not walked. And I looked at the Syriac to see, and I think I would have translated it the same way, but the English translation that I have of the Syriac did not translate it that way, so my Syriac is not nearly good enough to make the point, but it's possible. It's possible that even the Aramaic or the Syriac Peshitta translates it "did not walk." That's contrasted to wicked people, which wicked people are the blessed man's opposite. They're like chaff. They won't stand in the judgment, and they're excluded from the congregation of the righteous. So, what are we to do with this? Are we to come and have an existential approach to the Psalms and say, well, just be like the blessed man? Well, are you like the blessed man? Do you reject the counsel of evil? Do you delight day and night on God's Torah? Have you done that your entire life? And most people would say no. I think David would say no. That's why David put Psalm 3 first. He's saying, look, I'm going to own my own sin here. I'm not the blessed man. I'm not the anointed king of Psalm 2. Well, what does Psalm 2 say? And how should we understand it? Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Now that's a perfectly valid translation. I think that's the ESV. It's an exact representation of the words. Let me do it another way and see if it helps us. The kings of the earth have set themselves, and the rulers have taken their counsel together against the Lord and against his Messiah, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast their cords from us. Does that make a difference in how you approach this psalm? If you translate it Messiah, against his Messiah. So Messiah just means anointed one, but if you do anointed, you could read it easily of David. But if you translate it Messiah, you would at least wonder if it isn't about the ultimate Messiah, and you would interpret it exactly the way Paul and Peter have in the New Testament. Let us burst their bonds apart and cast their cords. He who sits in the heavens laughs. Adonai holds them in derision. Adonai means my Lord. Adonai is the usual replacement for the tetragrammaton, YHWH. Adonai is what's used in Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. And so you read that and you wonder, well, what's going on there? Then he will speak to them in his wrath and will terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. Now I want to ask you a question. Who is the one speaking at this point? He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king. So who is the I and who is the king? You'd be tempted to read it that Adonai is the I, right? He will speak to them. I have set my king, and my king would be Yahweh. But then the I says, I will tell of the decree. YHWH said to me. YHWH said to me, you are my son. Today I've begotten you. Do you remember the day you were born, that conversation that you had with your mom and dad the day you were born? You know, you were born and you said, hi, Mom, and hi, Dad. And So glad to be a part. You remember that conversation? Yeah, I don't remember that conversation either because I can't remember anything before I was about 5 years old. Maybe there's one memory when I'm 2, but my first real memory, I think, is when I was 5 or 6 years old, and I couldn't talk the day I was born. This person is talking the day they're born. That seems odd to me. The Lord said to me, "You are my son. Today I've begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession." Was that true of David? Did David possess the ends of the earth? You, so this is Yahweh speaking to Adonai, you shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them into pieces like a potter's vessel. And then the psalmist gives some advice to people in rebellion. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve YHWH with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss din zone, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So I read that verse, and I say, why in the world did they put the word son in a different language? Have you ever read a book that does that? Like, does Tolkien do that some in Lord of the Rings, where he writes things in Elvish? The book that I love that does it is Watership Down, where the whole Watership Down is about a rabbit warren and their adventures, and the whole book is teaching you this rabbit language. And I remember when I read Watership Down, I was very interested because I thought, why in the world are they teaching me this artificial Latinesque rabbit language? And so I'm reading through, and as kind of a person who likes linguistics, I was wondering why is this in the rabbit language? And I wondered that until I got to the climax of the story. And all through the book Watership Down, anything that's given in the rabbit language is translated until you get to the culminating scene. And there, the words in the crucial part of the battle are only given in the rabbit language. And it's the funniest thing you've ever read in your life. I mean, I read it, and then I realized what it said in rabbit language. I just doubled over laughing, and I thought, that writer set me up where he taught me rabbit language, and then he was going to tell this just incredibly funny thing in the climax of this scene. Good writers do that. Interesting writers do that. So why in the world would the son be in another language? Why would the writer of the psalm go to the trouble of putting the word son in a completely different language than the rest of it was written in? It's interesting in Hebrew that if you tried to read it in Hebrew, the word son means the pure one. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So, kiss the Son. And I don't know if you can see that there. But this is the Aramaic, and it does mean son. The problem is this word isn't the word son that's used here. This is the word ben. This is a standard Hebrew word for son. This is bar, completely different word. If you tried to read this in Hebrew, it would say, kiss the pure one. Was David pure? This last part, to me, is just stunning. Blessed are those, so this is our inclusio. 1:1 started with this, 2:12 ends with it. It's saying read these two sections together. Blessed are all those taking refuge in Him. When I was an undergraduate student at State University, I had the privilege of studying Hebrew with a young man. I think it was his very first appointment to teach, and a great teacher. I loved him as a teacher. Odd thing, a group of 5,000 people graduated in my graduating class, and that day they had the professors go out in the audience and find someone to sit with, and this Hebrew scholar sat next to me in my graduation. And so that was kind of interesting. What was really interesting is that by the time that scholar died, he had become the preeminent Hebrew scholar in the world on Psalms. He wrote the book on the editing of the Psalms. And it was interesting because if you ask him the question, blessed are those who take refuge in Him, and you said, who is the Him there? Grammatically, who is the Him? Kiss the Son lest He be angry. You perish in the way, for His wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are those who take refuge in Him. Who is the Him? It's the Son. And if you ask my teacher, who is the Him, he would say grammatically, it's the Son. When you look at the Hebrew grammar of the verse, it has to be the Son. But my professor would say also, but it can't be the Son. Because everywhere else in the Psalter it says, do not take refuge in man, take refuge in Yahweh. Since my professor died, people have visited this idea of editing the Psalter, and they've pointed out that in the beginning of the Psalter you have Yahweh and the King, but by the end of the Psalter, those two figures seem to be merged. What if that's what's happening in Psalm 2? What if the blessed man of Psalm 1 and 2 isn't David, but rather was always the Messiah? And what if Psalm 2 was never about David, but was always about the eternal Son of God who was perpetually begotten? And what if the whole point is, blessed are those who take refuge in Jesus? I don't know if this is the reason, but did you know that there are 1,189 chapters in the Bible, and 260 of those chapters are written in Greek. We call it the New Testament. Did you know that? The rest of it, almost 939 chapters, all that is written in Hebrew, except 7 chapters. It's a part of a chapter in Ezra. It's a sentence in Genesis, or part of a sentence. It's one sentence in Jeremiah. But then the main portion of it is from Daniel. And Daniel is written in Aramaic. This is what Jesus quoted. Jesus quoted this verse, and they crucified him over it. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And here's the word like. And what do you notice about the word son? That's our word from Psalm 2. There came one like the Son of Man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and he was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, languages might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. That's picking up Isaiah 9, right? The government will be on his shoulders, and of the increase of his kingdom there will be no end. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom will be one that will not be destroyed. Jesus quoted that verse, and they crucified him over it. And the reason is because Jews, when they read that verse, realized that this figure was too godlike to be real. And so they determined that here you have a person being glorified in God's presence. That can't be true. Jesus quotes the verse, and they crucify him over it. They crucify him because he claimed to be the bar. Kiss the bar, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way. His wrath is quickly Blessed are those who take refuge in him. Why did David put Psalm 3? I mean, he's airing his own dirty laundry there. He's bringing up the fact that he slept with another man's wife and killed the man and kept his wife, and that he did not follow God. Why would David do that? He did that because he's saying, I'm not the guy in Psalm 1. And not only am I not the guy in Psalm 1, I'm not the Messiah in Psalm 2. But I can tell you this, the people who are guilty sinners, if they take refuge in that Messiah, they'll be blessed. If these two psalms are a preface to the entire Psalter, if they form an inclusio, they're inviting us to realize that we aren't the blessed man of Psalm 1. That's why David, I want you to think about this. Psalm 18, the speaker, David writes it. It has his name on it. But the writer says, "Bless me, O Lord, according to the righteousness of my hands." What do you think about that coming from David? Bless me according to the righteousness of my hands. What had David's hands done? Molested another man's wife? Written a letter that put to death a faithful servant? And you say, well, maybe David wrote that before all that. Well, no, because when David died, right before he died, in 2 Samuel, he repeats Psalm 18 verbatim, spells the whole thing out. You've blessed me according to the righteousness of my hand. Either David has the shortest memory of anybody who ever lived, or the person speaking Psalm 18 is not David, but rather the voice of Jesus. It seems to me that Psalm 1 and 2 is inviting us to question our assumption about who the speaker of the Psalms are. And it's why so many, like Martin Luther and others, are saying, this is the voice of the Messiah. This is the Messiah speaking for his people. He's saying things that could not be true of David. If you start reading the Psalms like that, if you start reading the seams, that is, where the books come together, you'll realize that some very interesting things are happening there when the books are put together, inviting us to this Christocentric reading. I think we'll end there and think about that, and I'll see you on Tuesday.